So let's look at the first lock the society has put on the cage of the Bible, and that is the belief that some or most of what the Bible teaches is scientifically impossible. There is a deep and pervasive belief in our culture that science and the Bible are at odds with each other, that they contradict each other, that one doesn't have anything to say to the other, and that one must choose one or the other. You've probably heard people say, well, I believe in science, as if believing in science means you can't believe the Bible. On the other hand, we've heard people say, well, I'm a person of faith, as if being a person of faith means you can just discount all of the scientific evidence. Christians are often portrayed as ignorant simpletons when it comes to science. And often we're accused of standing in the way of science. I don't know how many times I've heard people say, well, Christians, they always just want to say God did it, and then we don't need to do science anymore, because that just explains it all. I was watching a debate on Friday between two scientists. They were talking about intelligent design. And one debater, with all of the passion he could muster, said, if we teach intelligent design in the classrooms, it will kill curiosity. And that may be true for a few Christians, but I think that is a completely false characterization of Christianity as a whole. In fact, I think it's kind of amusing because from a historical perspective, if there were no Christianity, there would be no modern science as we know it. Because Christianity, in a sense, created modern science. Most of the early scientists, Kepler, Galileo, Newton, and many, many others, were Christian men who held deep convictions that there was a God, that he created the universe, and that he revealed himself in the Bible, which was absolutely true and infallible. And in fact, it was their belief in God that even made them want to study nature. No one was doing this. But it is because they believed God created it that made them even want to study it. Think about this for a second. If the universe was just a big cosmic accident formed by random, natural, purposeless processes, then why in the world would anybody care to study it? What could you possibly learn from disorganized chaos? It would be like a teacher walking into a classroom and dumping out a bag of Scrabble pieces and saying, now study this. There's going to be a test tomorrow. A test on what? You couldn't make any sense of it. But these men had the conviction that the universe was created by a loving and intelligent God. And if he created it, then it was organized, and it was purposeful, and it had meaning. And you know what? If we study nature, maybe we can learn more about the God who created it. D. James Kennedy wrote a book about how no other religious worldview in the Middle Ages could have given rise to modern science except Christianity. Listen to what Johannes Kepler said about science. He said, the chief aim of all investigations of the external world should be to discover the rational order and harmony which has been imposed on it by God. He'd probably be laughed at by many people today. But this idea that science is incompatible with the Bible was not even widespread until the late 19th century when two very important books were written. And there's a slide for this one too. The first one in 1875 by John William Draper called History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. And another one 20 years later in 1895 by Andrew Dixon White called A History of the Warfare of Science with Theology in Christendom. And you can just tell by the title what their thesis is. They hated Christianity, and they wanted to portray this view that if you believed in science, you could not believe in the Bible, that they were absolutely diametrically opposed to each other. The only problem is they had to completely rewrite history to make their case. And historians have now proved that they have skewed all of the historical evidence to fit their thesis. Let me just give you an example. One example they used was the conflict between Galileo and the church. And unfortunately, their version of the story has been beautifully preserved in many secular history books. Maybe you've heard about it. According to their account, Galileo made some observations with his telescope that led him to believe that the teachings of the church were all wrong because they believed that the earth was at the center of the solar system. But he, in fact, thought, no, the sun is at the center of the solar system, and so the church and the Bible must be wrong. Well, he published his findings, and the church was just irate. They ordered him to recant because he was a heretic. And when he refused to recant, they said, fine. They excommunicated him and said, science goes your way, the church and the Bible will go this way, and never the two shall meet. Well, the real story is quite different. The conflict was not between church and science. There were actually divisions on both sides. On the one side, many scientists disagreed with Galileo on the basis of science. And in fact, since then, many of his techniques have been found to be inaccurate. So it wasn't as though there was this big unified body of scientific community rallied against the church. And on the other side, there were divisions. In the church, some theologians agreed with Galileo and said, well, maybe our interpretation of the Scripture is wrong. And others said, no, we disagree with him. But it's not as though it has been portrayed as a battle between science and the Bible. It's just not as clear-cut as that. And I think this is really important for our time because I think we are in a very similar situation. Many people want to try to characterize the current debate as a conflict between science and religion, as if all the scientists and intellectuals are completely unified against the Bible and against religion in general. But that's just not true. There is sharp division even among scientists. Some are staunch atheists, others are devout Christians, and there's all kinds somewhere in between. And even in the church, there is division among Christians. Some people want to fully embrace Darwinism and his ideas of evolution and say, well, that's just how God created it. Others on the other end say, well, no, the scientific evidence is just fooling us. And then there are some of us in between who say, no, both of those are wrong. So there's this idea that science and religion are automatically opposed to each other is not true. The point I want to make is this is not an either-or proposition. It's not either science or the Bible. It is both science and the Bible. Both are revelations from God about himself, and both are completely harmonious with each other. And let me just share one story that I think perfectly illustrates this point. A few years ago, Pastor Ed introduced me to the work of an astronomer named Hugh Ross, who has an incredible testimony. He is a scientific prodigy who, by the time he was 16, was teaching university lectures in astronomy. When he was 17 years old, he was the director of observations for the Astronomical Society in Vancouver, in Canada. And he decided to go on a God quest. He was not an atheist per se, but he grew up in a home that was completely non-religious. He had no religious affiliation or grounding at all. And so he decided he would do a systematic study of the world religions. He began to secretly study all of the holy books of the world religions. He began in the East and worked his way west, so Christianity was toward the end. And as he began looking in these holy books, one thing in particular he was interested in. What did they say about the origin of life, about the origin of the universe, and then compare that with what I know as a trained astronomer. And he looked through all of these holy books one after another, and they were dismal failures. And he almost gave up and said, well, maybe I should be an atheist. And then he found the Bible. And I've got a slide here with these are his own words. He said, from page 1, this book proved an exception. Not only did it provide hundreds of statements that could be tested for accuracy, it also anticipated thousands of years in advance many facts of nature that research would one day confirm. For example, it described the 4 fundamental features of Big Bang cosmology. 1, the beginning of space and time coincident with the beginning of matter and energy. 2, continual expansion of the universe from the cosmic beginning. 3, the consistency of physical laws. And 4, the pervasiveness of entropy, which is decay. And he continues on. Through nearly 2 years of study, this book's predictive power persuaded me that it must have been inspired by one who knows and guides the past, present, and future. I had essentially proven to myself that the Bible is more reliable than the laws of physics I'd focused on in my university courses. The only reasonable conclusion I could see was that the Bible must be the inspired Word of God. So I think we can break that lock. Let's look at number 2. The next lock is the idea that the Bible is historically unreliable. And this one is interesting because Christianity is a historical religion. It is based on real historical events that really happened. It makes claims about things that can be testified by different branches of science. And this is important because a lot of religions do not. They're just philosophical thought patterns. They can't be tested. But Christianity makes claims that can be tested by science. It makes reference to various places and people and customs. And if it were true, then we can expect that archaeology would be able to verify that these people, places, and customs actually were real. And that's exactly what has happened. Of course, we can't expect that every person and place mentioned in the Bible would be verified. But an overwhelming amount of evidence has come in. But you know, there are some people who are so skeptical that they want to say that wherever evidence is lacking, we have to assume the Bible is wrong until more evidence comes in. In other words, they want to hold the Bible to a standard of guilty until proven innocent, which is completely arbitrary because no other ancient text is held to that standard. But that's okay because the Bible can withstand the scrutiny. Now, the amount of archaeological evidence is so vast, we could spend days and days looking at it, but I know that your patience has limits. So I just want to share one thing that I think is really interesting and really important on this matter. For a long time, there were some people and places in the Bible for which archaeology had not found any concrete evidence. For example, there was no archaeological evidence, no artifacts supporting David, Israel's most famous king. And so many people for a long time just assumed that he was a legend, a mythical figure. But in 1993, archaeologists were digging in northern Israel, and they found a stone from the 8th century BC with an inscription about a military battle between an Aramean king and the king of Israel, and, quote, the king of the house of David. And this was the first time that any mention of David was ever found in concrete evidence. And it was a bombshell to skeptics. Time magazine wrote up a huge article about it, which I unfortunately wasn't able to read at the time because I was only in first grade. But the point I was making is that there's so much archaeological evidence for the historical veracity of the Bible that this argument's really hard to maintain. So I think we can break that lock after I show you a quote from archaeologist Nelson Gluck. Here's what he said about archaeology in the Bible. He said, "It may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference. Scores of archaeological findings have been made which confirm in clear outline and exact detail historical statements in the Bible. And by the same token, proper evaluation of biblical descriptions has often led to amazing discoveries." So I think we can break that lock. Which, by the way, I didn't mention this in the other services, and maybe I should have. But this is unique among the Bible. There are other holy books that make statements that are not only not verified, but are completely contradicted. For instance, the Book of Mormon, which claims that the Native Americans were direct descendants from the lost 10 tribes of Israel. Geneticists have proved that there is zero genetic connection between the native North Americans and Israelites. Completely controverted. So the Bible is unique in this, and I think that's an important point to make. So we break that